My name is Eugenio Refini, I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm really delighted to be introducing tonight's event for various reasons. Well, first of all, of course, the intellectual sort of standing of the event itself, but also personal reasons, because we are sort of celebrating tonight the publication of two, not one, as is often the case, but two books by one of our cherished colleagues, Professor Ara Merjian, who's a professor here in the Department of Italian Studies, and a beloved colleague with whom we share so much in terms of our daily life in the department, and it's wonderful to be celebrating these very important publications. Different in nature. I won't say much about these books because we have experts in the field who will be talking about them. I just would like to sort of highlight the fact that Ara is a real powerhouse, and these are results of both very thorough study of the field, but also the ability, especially the book which you see on the left side of the page of the slide, the ability of summarizing very difficult concepts. And we have two different genres: the short introduction on the one hand, and a thorough study of a specific topic on the other hand. And I think Ara is wonderful at doing both things. I won't go through the entire list of publications of Ara because he is even too productive in terms of keeping track of everything. Let me just mention briefly the two titles which we are celebrating tonight: Futurism, a very short introduction with Oxford University Press, and Fragments of Totality, Futurism, Fascism, and the Sculptural Avant-Garde, which both came out within the past few months. Now, in order to celebrate this double bill tonight, we have two experts who will be sharing their knowledge. So after a presentation by Ara himself, which will kick us off tonight, we have the distinct pleasure of having with us Anthony White and Lauren Bernard. I will briefly introduce them now so that then we can go ahead with the evening smoothly. Associate Professor Anthony White is Head of Art History and Art Curatorship at the University of Melbourne, and a visiting scholar here in the Department of Italian Studies at NYU. His research focuses on the history of modern and contemporary art. He's the author of several important publications: Italian Modern Art in the Age of Fascism, 2020, and Lucio Fontana, Between Utopia and Kitsch, 2011, and also the co-author of Variations, A More Diverse Picture of Contemporary Art, 2023, and Art as Enterprise, Social and Economic Engagement in Contemporary Art of 2016. His writing has appeared in the journals Grey Room, October, and Third Text, and in catalogues published by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. Then we have with us Lauren Bernard, who earned her PhD in historical musicology from Columbia University this past year. She holds degrees in music from the University of North Texas and Brandeis University, and has presented her work at institutions including MIT, Temple University, the Smithsonian Institute, and Université de Paris 8. Her current research interests include the perception of race in timbre and sound, musical constructions of alterity and identity, and Afrofuturism. Lauren's dissertation examines Afrofuturist music in the 20th century, interrogating the ways in which white supremacy, stemming from the colonial encounter and beyond, influences the ways that Afrofuturists construct sonic identities. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the podium Ara Merjian, and then of course we will go ahead with our distinguished guests. And thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thanks so much, Eugenio, and thanks to everyone. Summing up an as expansive and manic and avant-garde as Futurism is a tough task, but it's perhaps further inflected by the fact that nowadays, even at whether in the press or in casual conversation, one hears people say, that so-and-so is a futurist, whether a techno-futurist or an Afro-futurist or an Indo-futurist. One doesn't hear terribly often, oh, such and such is a Dadaist, such and such is a constructivist, such and such is a surrealist. So why and how is it that this avant-garde continues to have currency in our culture, not just American culture, but international culture? And how do we reconcile its deeply ambivalent legacy between, on the one hand, of course, eventually an open and avowed and active support of a fascist regime, and on the other hand, what I would call, and what I have called, the kind of avant-garde unconscious of the 20th century, to the extent that it was really with Futurism the first comprehensive avant-garde of the 20th century, that aesthetics no longer comprise simply the fine arts, right? Paintings and sculptures that hung in bourgeois living rooms, but that it comprised not only the material facets of everyday life, but also the habits of protest, of activism, of intervention into politics. And so just giving a brief kind of summary of, I guess, what I've done in both books, and starting out with the spate of press, which even in recent weeks continues to highlight the legacies of Futurism in our own government closer to home. And this was just from 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, an article that highlighted this Silicon Valley futurist Andreessen's love of F.T. Marinetti's founding manifesto of Futurism and various other texts which the movement propounded. How is it that this avant-garde still has not only a kind of generalized currency, but an actual influence upon contemporary ideology, whether from Silicon Valley or more diffuse? And in some sense, the original tech bro was F.T. Marinetti himself, who not only had the ideas and the ambition as a poet and critic, but the means, the financial means. He was born in Alexandria, Egypt, to haute bourgeois Italian parents in a very cosmopolitan community, was educated in French by Jesuits. And interestingly enough, and we'll return to this at least a couple of times, with the publication of his novel Gli Indomabili, The Untamables, in, I believe, the 1930s, a very waggish Italian critic announced to the public, the founder of Futurism is African, and everyone will sooner or later have to deal with this fact. It was, of course, a waggish and provocative statement. Marinetti is African only, of course, by virtue of his birth in Egypt, but it is, in some ways, a kind of claim to primitivism which haunts Futurism from the start, a movement which, with unrivaled ambition, aimed to move Italy past its being mired in a kind of the rich and crippling patrimony of Italy, which James Joyce, visiting the Forum around 1907, wrote to his brother saying that the Roman Forum reminded him of a young man who charges money for individuals to come visit his grandmother's corpse. This is the state of Italy, which Lamartine called Europe's graveyard, against which the Futurists rebelled. And they rebelled with a spate of manifestos on everything from clothing to music to theater to photography to film and, of course, to politics in ways that actively, obliquely, and directly affected the fascist regime. But it started out in the founding manifesto of Futurism with Marinetti recounting how he left his bourgeois, the cloistered home in Milan to essentially emerge into the city, to embrace the noise and tumult of actual life rather than its cloistered domestic comforts. But as it turns out, this narrative, which anchors the founding manifesto of Futurism, and again, the Futurists became the experts in producing manifestos. They were, in a sense, the ones who brought the tradition of the Communist Manifesto, the Symbolist Manifesto, into the 20th century as a declaration of action, of intervention into life. And as it turns out, Marinetti was not lying when he wrote about actually taking his roadster out for a spin and crashing it, and this being the origin story of Futurism, an origin story no less forceful than those that we find in Homer or in Virgil. And as we'll talk about, he also talks about the origins of his Sudanese wet nurse in Alexandria. Again, the testament to an haute bourgeois childhood, which was able to have a black woman as the badia, as the nanny, and how he compares the rebirth emerging out of this ditch, out of this crash, as the origin story of Futurism. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the tensions in Futurism between progress and reaction, between a kind of liberating modernity and various elements that, of course, today are deeply problematic. Just briefly, one of the many ways in which the Futurists short-circuited the idea of what the avant-garde or what modernism was or could be, they looked very similar to the bourgeois that they wanted to épater, that they wanted to scandalize. These aren't unkempt, unwashed bohemians living in a Montmartre garret, right? These are businessmen who had the means and the ambition to propagandize their work worldwide through exhibitions, through manifestos, which now, of course, appear as sort of prized artifacts under glass in museums. But we should recall that the Futurists proclaimed that they wanted their works to essentially not be left to posterity, that every generation should create its own works of art and architecture. They wanted essentially to obviate the notion of patrimony or posterity itself. And this was itself a kind of momentous intervention. So in this book, the opening line is from Marinetti himself in this very short introduction, which he in some ways kind of predicted or anticipated, right? It's stupid to write 100 pages when just one would do. This will to synthesis, to concision, to brevity, borrowed from journalism, from the journalistic dispatch, that academics talked too much, right? That individuals should not talk and ruminate, they should act. And this, of course, has, again, deeply ambivalent consequences in the 20th century. But this notion of the avant-garde as a site of action rather than simply aesthetic contemplation is something that runs through the entire gamut of Futurism's life. From World War I, we should note, to World War II. So Marinetti and company did not simply agitate for intervention into World War I on behalf of the Entente powers. He himself went to serve on the Russian front in the Second World War, and the Futurist movement only dissolved in 1944 after a full-throated support of both fascism and its deeply racist empire. So this is just some of the way that the book has approached these different issues, and just as a kind of case study. Something that appears in some ways in both books in shifting attention away from the attention to the efforts of Umberto Boccioni, the most famous Italian futurist sculptor and theorist, to a different set of work by Balla and Depero, written during World War I, titled humbly enough the futurist reconstruction of the universe. What exactly that meant. And in a sense, what it means was a reconfiguration not just of the material world, not just of aesthetic objects, but of ideology, of our relationship to the world itself as potentially futurist. And as I'll talk about just shortly, why do they use sculpture as the starting point of that reconstruction, that reconfiguration? Why and how is it that sculptural objects, particularly objects made now from materials as diverse as string and talcum powder and glass and metal and foil is the starting point, not just for aesthetic experimentation, but for a reconfiguration of our approach to the world at large. Futurism, of course, starts out borrowing from what we would call post-impressionist aesthetics, eventually assimilating cubist aesthetics and painting in this kind of geometric faceting, but it very quickly expands its ambition beyond what we would call the fine arts to every imaginable format, from architecture to theater to photography. And so thinking about, and this is the most famous emblem of futurist sculpture on the right, thinking about its assimilation not only of cubism to this kind of breaking of the object and spreading of it into the larger environment as a kind of both symbolic and metaphorical irruption into the viewer space, right? The futurists said, we want to place the viewer in the center of the picture. That was one of their most famous anthems. But sculpture itself can erupt into the viewer's space immediately, physically, concretely. And so thinking, turning a little bit of attention to why and how that happens. Also taking seriously the fact that the futurists, despite their in many ways kind of callous earnestness, also had a sense of playful, impish humor. This is from a lost film, futurist film, in which the artist Balla is said to marry a chair and a stool is born. The extent to which futurism anticipated not just elements of constructivist aesthetics, but also surrealism and Dada. Though not to take away from the earnestness of this individual, the same individual who named his daughters Propeller and Light. The extent to which these modernists took seriously their work as a matter of ideological righteousness, right? I mean, I often remind my students that, Piet Mondrian never talked to Van Doesburg after he used diagonal lines in his painting. In the 20s. These people took this work as a matter of life and death, and the futurists very much took it as a matter of life and death. The term avant-garde, many of you probably already know, is a military term. It means those who serve in advance of the regular army. And the futurists actually rendered that literal. They created an actual, not just a metaphorical avant-garde of artists, but their own battalion in the northern front of World War I, during which two of the main futurists actually come to die, including Umberto Boccioni, the author of this sculpture, which you can find both at the Met and at MoMA. It is the most widely recognized futurist work of art. It also now adorns the 20-cent euro coin. And so in some ways, and I'll come back to this image, thinking about navigating the ways in which the earlier iterations of futurism, to what extent they were formalist, a play with a certain kind of aesthetic form, and to what extent were they actually interventions into ideology, which could then be assimilated by the fascist regime. And here is Boccioni himself posing with an early iteration of his sculpture. This is while he was home from the front. And interestingly enough, the work many years later in the 30s adorned the cover of this journal issue, edited by Mino Somenzi, who was a Jewish Italian futurist whose studio was eventually shuttered by the regime. And yet here it is illustrating an article on modern art and race, as of course in some ways emblematic of a certain kind of Italian elan and vitalism and will to power. And that will to power was of course rendered literal and embodied in the Duce eventually. And this is a New York Times article on the paradox in some ways of the regime's support for as modernizing an aesthetic as AfroFuturism, which really seized Italian culture in the 1930s. Even Mussolini had gotten his pilot's license. The airplane became the new fetish, the new totem of modernity, and the futurists latched onto that as their one of the key avenues of their claim to represent fascist aesthetics. And so here you have the Colosseum forming Mussolini's brain, and his throat here constituted by Piazza Venezia and the crowds gathering under his office to hear him speak. So, this emerging in the 1930s, such an image would actually be unthinkable, of course, in Nazi Germany. And indeed, in 1934, there was an exhibition in Berlin of Italian futurist aero painting, which Goebbels actually initially enthusiastically advocated for, but was quickly marginalized. As German culture sort of contracted in its expansiveness, such things became absolutely unthinkable, whereas in Italy they persisted for several years. So what do we do with the fact that such images are now invoked apropos of our very contemporary politics? And not just casually, not just incidentally, but again and again. What do we do with, do we throw out the noxious bathwater with the avant-garde baby, right? Can something of Futurism's other elements persist? And one of the things, there's a lot of work done on Futurism and women, Futurism and which paradoxically, again, for all of Futurism's machismo, it's a very real misogyny. It's also a movement that gave a huge platform to women artists, writers, dancers, sculptors, an unprecedented amount of gallery time, of attention, of again, a platform. And so paying attention to that, paying attention also to the paradoxical fact that Ardengo Soffici, one of the early futurist theorists and painters and critics, declared one of his most emblematic futurist paintings a dance of the quote-unquote pederasts, the common word for gay people at the turn of the century, painting which no longer exists, but which depicted if you squint, two individuals in the foreground seated at this bar, Lloyd's, in Paris, in some kind of very sort of accepted congress in one of these cafés chantants, in which you have a kind of the evocation of smoke, of music, of various letters, and you also have on the table here a book against sexual morality, which was written by another futurist, Italo Tavolato, who was himself homosexual, who was eventually press-ganged by the fascist secret police to be an informer. And so the sexual politics of Futurism, even more complicated and nuanced than its relationship to women. Marinetti himself, in many ways, publicly homophobic, but privately deeply supportive of various gay individuals. And, thinking again about the contributions of futurist women to the project, just to give you, again, one sample, Ruzena Zadkova, who was actually married to Marinetti's brother-in-law, and did this incredible multimedia sculpture. She was a bohemian Czech artist working in Rome and studied with Giacomo Balla, like so many artists between the world wars. And when she created the sculpture, Marinetti and Prampolini hailed it in their criticism. They couldn't speak enough to its brilliance. But how did they praise it? They talked again and again about its virility, about the fact that she had created a work that was quintessentially virile. And this, of course, reminds us of the writer Carlo Emilio Gadda talking about fascism, recalling how his memory as a young man growing up under fascism recalled that even women's vulvas were virile. right, according to fascist ideology. And thinking about, in some ways, the afterlife, and we'll talk about this now briefly about, or in a little bit, about the afterlife of futurism in a tendency, not a movement per se, but a tendency which, of course, pushes back against many of the deeply racist and imperialist tropes in which futurism anchored itself, particularly in the 1930s. And it's probably, I guess, one of my crowning, proudest moments to have had in a Oxford University Press book a picture of Missy Elliott talking about Afrofuturism and futurism's afterlife. But just thinking very briefly about also, to return to the paradoxes of futurism, the fact that this deeply, inveterately nationalist movement was from the start also deeply international. There were futurist groups right from the start in Tbilisi, by Armenians, by Japanese, in Russia, in Buenos Aires, in Uruguay. And of course, its formal innovations were taken up by, in some ways, one could argue, the kind of not necessarily opposite ideological number, but very different kinds of ideological projects, which make us think about the fact that form itself is never intrinsically ideological. The ideology of form has to be argued for, it has to be obtained, it has to be secured through rhetoric, through argument. And in this way, futurism is inarguably, and in some ways, expansively influential throughout the 20th century because of its kind of relentless activity and intervention into every possible discipline. So just briefly, before we bring up our guests here, the book on sculpture looks particularly specifically about at why and how it is that sculpture became, why it's been largely overlooked in the scholarship on futurism, but how and why, when we think about even the word statue or statua in Italian, it derives from the word to stand. And the futurists opposed anything and everything static or still or isolated, right? So in some ways, sculpture became the most, I wouldn't say important because it was dwarfed by the number of paintings created, but it became a kind of challenge to the futurists to redo, to intervene into, precisely because of its relationship to Italy's patrimony, to a kind of encrusted classicism, to its relationship to a past, right, which Boccioni himself likened to a mummification, right? Sculptures, classical sculptures were considered mummies by the futurists. So why and how is it that that futurism intervened into sculpture, which it did early on in a language very derivatively derived from Cubism, right? These are very, very sort of clear importations from Cubism. But very early on, interestingly enough, an event which I sort of homed in on and which has been largely ignored, early on they had, at one of these international futurist exhibitions in Rome in 1914, they created a slab of clay, which they outfitted with arms, which they stuck a pen into its head and also an onion, and they essentially labeled it Benedetto Croce, a sort of passeist philosopher associated with what they considered to be deeply outmoded modes of thought, and they slapped it. They carried it in a kind of mock procession. So sculpture itself was, like Marinetti's car crash, not just an object, but an event, something unfolding in time as much as space, something entailing a kind of social and physical action. On the other hand, sculpture for the futurists also came, particularly out of the strand that comes out of Balla's studio, with things which gave rise, in a certain sense, with a kind of very paradoxically, bourgeois sort of interiority. The futurists claimed to want to disrupt, to destroy, to erupt the bourgeois home. And yet Balla's work actually not only anticipated elements of Art Deco, which they themselves recognize, but were essentially created for the home and anticipated what we would now call design. And so the long afterlife of Italian design, which is now one of its main exports, owes a great deal to this futurist impulse, which was not just about destroying, and exploding spaces, which was their normal sort of shtick. But there was another strain of futurism, which was very much anti-capitalist, but not anti-bourgeois, but never anti-capitalist. There was this network of gallery systems under fascism still. Many of the futurists still contributed and made works for private patrons. Futurism never assailed the actual capitalist kind of production, even as they continually sought to sort of scandalize the bourgeoisie. And so even just thinking about, here is Balla's studio with its sort of totalizing every surface, essentially, this microcosm of futurist ambition, and his famous sculpture of Boccioni's fist here came to be stored as if it was just part of this kind of built environment, this very sort of innocuous, benign element of the built environment. And just a couple of other things. The fact, which has been largely ignored, that the fact that there was a very prominent left-wing strain of futurism in the 1920s. So we think oftentimes that futurism immediately became the mouthpiece of the fascist regime. But this is actually not true. For a number of years, particularly when Marinetti was alienated from Mussolini, before their rapprochement in 1924, there was a very strong strain of left-wing futurism, particularly by Ivo Panaggi and Palladini, who sought to reconcile futurism with what we would call international constructivism and a language of the proletariat. Marinetti even led tours by proletariat workers in Turin of a futurist exhibition, and Antonio Gramsci himself and even Lunasharsky talk about futurism as a potentially exciting new form of popular communist culture. You also have a Slovenian artist, and this graces the cover of the book, his constructivist cabinet, who's working in Trieste, the city of Trieste, which of course had been redeemed by Italian forces in World War I, made Italian again after the crumbling of the Habsburg Empire, working in a language which was informed by futurism, but which also imagined just simple abstract objects to be comrades, in a sense, to be accessible precisely through a new language of just mere kind of objecthood, which evoked tools, which evoked things that could be used, but which of course fell short of utility. Well, what happens to an artist like Cernigoj after the Mussolini regime and the cultural, essentially colonization and repression of Slovenian and other Slavic identities? He's forced to join a fascist art syndicate and to create nice fascist saluting balilla, young futurists, for these facades. And you even have a nice stylized modernist fasces here hailing the Duce, whose likeness increasingly essentially eclipsed the, in many cases, was merged with, in a sense, these attempts at modernism. And one of the chapters is devoted to this work, which has been on display before here at the Casa, the continuous profile of Mussolini, which of course evokes the all-seeing omniscience of Janus, which is where we get the word for January, seeing both the future and the past, the god of entryways, of new beginnings, but which also concretizes a profile which essentially spoke for itself. Mussolini was the first prime minister without facial hair and eventually without any sort of hair at all. But it also evoked everything from these cannes séditieuses, these walking canes, to ceramic insulators, which were essentially associated with a kind of futurist dynamism, to both Etruscan chickpea, these sort of cult religious objects, to elements imagining Mussolini as essentially a kind of the primal scene of fascist ideology, right? And even a work like this, essentially lionizing the birth of himself from his own forehead, much like, I believe is it Hera from Zeus's forehead, right? A kind of self-reproduction, right? Which is something that Marinetti himself kind of stages in his founding novel, Mafarca, where man can create a son without the aid of woman. And of course, much less subtle evocations of bodily parts, which Mussolini's likeness came to embody, and thinking about the role of sculpture in the built environment, in what the futurists eventually called plastic muralism, and just finally thinking about also something that the book calls attention to, and this is something that we'll hopefully talk about just briefly in our discussion, the extent to which futurist works, despite their relatively limited reach, helped accustom an Italian populace not only to war eventually, but to imperial dominion. As it turns out, this Day of the Wing, which celebrated this phenomenon of aeromania. It's hard to reiterate the extent to which the aeroplane was considered the new vehicle of modernity, and helped fascism position itself as a kind of modernism, something that would bring Italy into, we always hear Mussolini made the trains run on time, which actually, as it turns out, was not entirely true. But Mussolini also not only had his pilot's license, but, for example, this squadron was taken out, and a mock African village was created outside of Rome, and these planes actually strafed it. So even in 1930, this is 5 years before the invasion of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, they used airplanes to stage the destruction of a mock African village. So the extent to which this kind of rhetoric and imagery helps to kind of set the stage for and encourage and to incite a kind of imperial fantasy is important. And Marinetti at one point says that eventually the futurists needed to dominate, they needed to conquer Africa plastically. That through the various images of a kind of dominion over and assertion of sovereignty over these spaces, that this would contribute essentially to the imperialist project. So I look at everything from these films celebrating economic autarky, which was self-sufficiency after the League of Nations imposes sanctions on Italy. They have to come up with their own minerals and various materials from within inside Italy. So they do all of these nice little exhibitions and films celebrating their own mineralogical richness, which of course could then be made over into these various things. But when they display raw materials extracted from the African colonies, they're displayed on the floor horizontally, which of course recapitulates and reiterates the associations of Africanness with a kind of floor-level primitivism, right? Awaiting the civilizing mission of verticality, right? Of a kind of uprightness. So thinking about minerals and the depictions of, this is hard to translate into English, but svecchiatore would be like unolding, a futurism that de-ages and speeds up Italian culture. And you have these depictions of African natives, whether from Libya or the Horn of Africa. These look essentially like North Africans, looking almost like benighted, either completely passive or bewildered by these various aerial missions. And of course, the notion of Africa itself as a site, not just of visual dominion, but of tactile dominion. Marinetti's, one of his panels is called Paris, Sudan, evoking also his Sudanese wet nurse, right? And these were panels that were actually meant to be touched rather than looked at. And so what does it mean later on in a sculpture made by a futurist who actually went to serve in the imperial conquest of Africa to create a sculpture which essentially invites basically touch as much as sight. And you have the Italian tricolor flag piercing this group, which is not just an abstraction, but which is actually a group of Africans, whether in Libya or in the Horn of Africa, because the jalabeya is used in both places, it's unclear. What does it mean to invite a kind of tactile display, or even as it emerged with the Futurist cookbook? Many of you might know that Marinetti eventually wrote this cookbook, which seems sort of silly and playful and in a sense pathetic by the 1930s. But some of the recipes actually entailed recipes that included essentially colonial stuff that one would ingest, right? Pistachios, other foodstuffs from Africa that one would ingest while touching other things. So the process of kind of assimilating culturally entailed not just even tactile elements, but almost gastronomical ones. The relationship of a sculpture like this to these photogrammetric maps for mapping and, of course, controlling and surveying these areas is something that I look like. And also a work which purports to be a quote-unquote portrait of a Negro, but of course is anything but a portrait. And yet, interestingly enough, sort of reprises the materials of futurism, of technologically advanced futurism, and projects them onto a colonial subject. There are some exceptions, like the sculptress Regina, who was a prominent Aero-futurist sculptor, who lends some dignity to the Abyssinian women, which she sculpted here. But for the most part, Africanness was essentially interchangeable with a kind of plasticity of futurist rhetoric. Africanness was at once the lack of plasticity and embodied plasticity. And so the extent to which bodies were imagined to be created of the very substances which they labored in, whether chocolate or rubber, is something that appears repeatedly. And why is it that sculpture, again, is used essentially as in this rhetoric of protecting the Italian race from infection, whether by Jewishness or blackness? Why is it that the sculptural body essentially is staged again and again as that which must be protected? And so just as a kind of envoi, thinking about how, and this is something hopefully we can talk about now, different discourses can reclaim from these various racist evocations of the black body and a futurism period, how some of these different practices might reclaim those discourses in ways that are that foreground agency by the very subjects who had been objectified and plasticized essentially by futurism. And then I just this is a kind of image from the after the liberation of Italy, in which the body itself is kind of posed as a living sculptor, and thinking about the New York Times' evocation now of futurism also as something both bound up with a kind of sleek consumerist design, but the extent to which Futurism echoes even in something like the spectacle of these floating QR codes in Shanghai, thinking about the fact that Boccioni imagined sculpture just to be a question of floating colored lights, essentially. But I have to end on this image, which reprises the head of Mussolini with William Cromar's continuous head of Drumpf, and thinking about how futurist discourse still kind of might inform different kinds of political resistance as well, even as it uses a language that was as reactionary as it was progressive. So thank you for indulging my logorrhea. So we can come up here.
Sure, yeah, I can go ahead. Thank you so much for having me here this evening, Dr. Merjian. It's a pleasure. Both books are exceptional, and as an Afrofuturism scholar myself, I learned so much about the movement to which Afrofuturism owes its historical underpinnings, Futurism, though it of course rebels against its deeply racist past. Both movements seek to tear down, upset, reconceive of, and restructure in deeply entrenched social, cultural, political, and artistic societal norms. However, there's a distinction between the two movements. Indeed, according to Afrofuturist scholar Eric Steinskog, quote, the classic European futurism, for example, the Italian kind, wanted a radical break with tradition, with history, and with the past. In a sense, they wanted the apocalypse, and from there to create a new futurist world. For Afrofuturism, on the other hand, it is not about wanting the apocalypse. The apocalypse has already taken place. End quote. For Afrofuturist scholars and practitioners, the worst, colonization, the Middle Passage, enslavement, has already occurred. Black people have already witnessed the apocalypse. Afrofuturism as an aesthetic and practice is all about tearing down the sociocultural norms associated with the apocalypse and turning towards a more ideal, technologically mediated Black future. However, futurism of the kind described in Dr. Merjian's text seeks to break with tradition out of a disdain for the established and ingrained cultural past, while remaining cognizant and self-aware of the movement's own future and eventual and inevitable demise or decline. Though it remains true that the futurist movement, particularly the second futurisms, close association with fascism and the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, has somewhat colored perceptions of futurism in the 21st century, a good deal of modern sociocultural and artistic movements, including Afrofuturism, owe an ideological debt to the ideals first established within the context of the original Italian futurist movement. The futurist movement's ideas about music, for example, laid the foundations for some of the most iconic and well-known American musical movements. For example, ideals laid out in Italian futurist Balilla Patella's Futurist Music, 1911, and Boccioni's The Art of Noise, 1913, would appear in the work of American artists such as John Cage in the second half of the 20th century. In fact, John Cage has a piece, 433, that's entirely silent. The incorporation of both noise and silence in musical works were revolutionary concepts and still appear in the contemporary music of today, as well as Afrofuturist musics. In this way, the linkages between futurism and subsequent movements are clear. I learned so much from the books, but I think I'd like to end my brief speech with a few closing questions and provocations for Dr. Merjian. In what ways did the futurist movement meaningfully change between its first and second iterations? Did the second iteration's stronger association with fascism lessen the movement's legitimacy for contemporary audiences? And secondly, in Fragments of Totality, you mentioned that, quote, sculptural works became the de facto flashpoints of fascist autarky. What in particular made sculpture a fertile ground for the expression of the principles of fascist autarky? In what other ways are the principles of autarky present in other kinds of futurist works? Thank you so much for your fascinating work, and thank you for having me.
Sure. Is my microphone on? Yes, it is. Great. So, yeah, thanks, everybody, and thank you to Ara and Susan there. I was very, very delighted to be invited to just briefly respond to Ara's work on Futurism. I'm a big follower of his work, and he's someone we often set for readings for our students in Melbourne in Australia, where I teach art history. So it's really exciting to be here and have a dialogue about that. And I think the way I'd like to respond to the two books, which I know quite well, having recommended one of them for publication myself. So yes, I had to read it very deeply. No problem. Checks in the mail, I hope. So there are a couple of things that I just would like to draw out, probably more of the more recent Oxford book, but really that touches on both of them. And the first, this sort of theme that I think really comes out strongly and is an important contribution to our understanding of Futurism is the way that Ara really kind of names and nails and explains the incongruities within Futurism. It's very easy to sort of talk about Futurism as some sort of radical movement that kind of turned the world upside down and everything was, not the same afterwards, or to kind of talk about it in terms of, well, they were a bunch of fascists and they were just all right-wing and extremists. And so one of the great things about both books, is, but particularly A Short History, is that Ara talks quite a lot about how and what kinds of incongruities are there and how I think, in fact, these incongruities are really at the heart of the movement. I mean, one of the things that I think is really, interesting is, for example, when we talk about the incongruities, Ara, you mentioned some of them before yourself, about the kind of nationalism on the one hand, but the cosmopolitanism on the other. You also mentioned in the books, the way in which they're very high tech and very pro technology, and yet they seem to have this photophobia, at a certain point in their history. And it seems sort of odd that you have a high tech movement that can't sort of deal with the most sort of high tech recent art form. There's also a real interesting incongruity you mentioned already about the kind of both this sort of scorn for women, but also like promoting the careers of women artists and how women were engaged in the movement. It's another sort of incongruity in the movement. And also, the desire for extreme influence and power that the movement had, really manifested in Marini's just highly caffeinated activity, while also sort of dreaming of their own self-destruction. That's really kind of a really interesting aspect of Futurism. So that's one theme I think that comes out of both books and that really helps us to understand the complexity of the movement. The second theme that I would just touch on briefly would be the question of totality and its relationship to the fragment, which is really the concern of the first book. And here, what I think is going on and what you argue is that it's in futurist sculpture, as I understand your argument, whereas we would kind of think of a fragment and as a totality as something that could never sort of have anything to do with each other. In futurist sculpture, it's precisely this dialectical, this dialogue that is one of the kind of powers of the sculptural aspect of Futurism. And so it's this idea of, when Boccioni produces a work which is called Fusion of a Head and a Window and includes real objects in the work, and these are fragments of the real world which are sort of cast into a work which is itself just a fragment of a reality, but it's in putting real objects in the work that Boccioni is able to gesture towards the broader totality of real life beyond the artwork. So again, it's sort of like an incongruity when you put it like that, but that's how the machine of futurist sculpture bridges that gap between the kind of contained object and the broader reality outside. The other thing about the relationship between the fragment and totality, I think, which is really important, is the idea of the way in which, I just noticed this when you showed the front page of the futurist reconstruction of the universe. You think, okay, it's a manifesto, so it should be a kind of coherent thing. It's kind of a crazy document, as we know. But right at the top there, I just noticed there's an advertisement. right in the middle of the page about something completely different, right? So this kind of little chunk of advertising just sort of lands in the middle of this sort of poetic manifesto. And I think for my idea, what I get out of your book anyway, is just the way in which marketing and advertising is this sort of it's a fragment which is being cast out to the horizon, just constantly being communicated. And lastly, what's really interesting about both books, I think, is the way you talk about politics and how, there's this sort of duality again in the politics of futurism. And it's quite clear that, they were absolutely, followers of Mussolini and fascist in so many ways. The imperialism of futurism, the militant, belligerent philosophy, the nationalism, the racism and so forth, they're all there to be seen, and we've spoken about them already. But as you point out, importantly, there are different aspects of futurism, and you can focus on other aspects of the philosophy like the anti-clericalism or the kind of proletariat emphasis and the rage against antiquarianism. But I think what's interesting is also you talk about how futurism and fascism share a lot of things. And I think when you talk about Mussolini's desire to demolish buildings in Rome so that he could create his imperial avenues, I mean, that itself was a kind of futurist gesture. And I think that's a really nice way of encapsulating what it was that futurism and fascism had in common. So lastly, I just want to leave it a little bit on a question as well. So maybe we won't get a chance to talk about these questions today, but there's a really nice moment in one of the chapters of the first book on the sculpture where you talk about how Depero and Balla kind of both consummated futurism but also travestied it. So, they sort of completed the futurist project in their later work where they went into these domestic environments and produced objects of design for sort of bourgeois consumption. That was the sort of final achievement of futurism, but it's also a travesty. It's a kind of betrayal of futurism's original, much more kind of idealistic purpose and much more ambitious purpose. And I think, it would be really interesting to hear you talk a little bit about, if there's time, how those two things can kind of coexist, because that's an incongruity. How can you be a true believer and a traitor at the same time? It's quite an extraordinary argument, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you both for these very, very generous comments and terrific questions. I'll just because it's fresh, I'll follow up on your last point, Anthony. Yeah, there is this incongruity to the extent that the futurists are all about. Some of their most famous anthems are, burn down the museums, kill the professors, right? Get rid of, throw the great works of art into the Tiber River. That we need a great kind of purging of artistic patrimony, and this notion of what fascism would eventually call permanent revolution, right? Which, in the case of fascism and in the case of futurism, belied in many ways, deeply conservative and bourgeois tendencies, or at least philo-capitalist tendencies. So Depero early on is not just talking about deconstructing sculpture and destroying culture, but he has a drawing where he's basically imagined what we would now call wearable tech, which is essentially noise-making gloves that one would wear that with different movements would create different kinds of noises. And a lot of what we now consider to be design, not simply what architects would call, from the spoon to the skyscraper, but also the notion of everything from our different apps on our phones to our DNA as elements of design, derives from this drive towards a futurist kind of totality, which was not just one of destruction and of kind of gleeful, anarchic exuberance. And early on, a lot of the futurists did have deeply active anarchic and socialist tendencies, just as they did eventually, gradually gravitate towards George Sorel and and ever more sort of philo-fascist kinds of ideologies. So yes, it is through and through this kind of relentlessly paradoxical movement. And again, I tried in some ways to kind of inflect things also in terms of the historical record. Marinetti was an active fascist. He served as one of the regime's kind of de facto propagandists. Mussolini was dispatching him in the 30s to give talks in Budapest and Berlin and other cities. But the fascist secret police also had a file on Marinetti. They were actually following him. The Futurists were never named the sort of chief movement of fascist culture, which was a stroke of genius by Mussolini, because he essentially, by never naming an official fascist culture, he forced them to compete with each other. And so one finds again and again the sort of deeply paradoxical strains. To get to Lauren's great question about autarky, so autarky is essentially just the policy or practice of economic self-sufficiency. So if other nations essentially boycott you through trade, you essentially have to start mining and producing materials from substances which you can find within your own the confines of your borders, which in Italy's case by the 30s also happened to include borders in North Africa and the Horn of Africa. But so why did sculpture become such a flashpoint? Because autarky was also about just materials. What materials could be mined within the Italian peninsula and its colonies? This notion of we'll make do with on our own, essentially. This could be literally kind of displayed in sculptural works, like made from aluminum and tin and other materials which could be mined. You had a futurist sculptor, Taillat, who eventually developed his own alloy from different autarkic materials. So sculpture became a kind of flashpoint for autarky because they could, as in these various exhibitions and displays, put on literal display materials that were mined and extracted from Italy and its colonies, and hence kind of showing its still, economic robustness even under the duress of international sanctions, basically. And your larger question, Lauren, about kind of what we do with Futurism's legacy is it's a great one and a tough one. And I mean, I think in some ways there's a real poetic justice in something like Afrofuturism, to the extent that it's a kind of, as I describe it in the shorter book, a kind of unwittingly, but a sort of cultural revenge in a certain sense on Futurism and its. You asked also about kind of the movement or the shifts between early Futurism and second Futurism, and second Futurism, as much as it is characterized by this obsession with flight and with airplanes, which is often very dehistoricized. It's something that I found very troubling in a lot of the literature, but also the exhibitions now, which happen in Italy again and again, of second Futurism, of these works which are sort of displayed. Even right now in Rome, there's just closing a major retrospective of Futurism at the National Gallery in Italy, and among colleagues, it has been incredibly controversial, to the extent that it's no coincidence that you have a new, very extremely right-wing government in Italy, one could say in many ways neo-fascist, and the story of Futurism that is being told in that exhibition is one of one that is in some ways kind of politicized, and you almost no mention of Marinetti's relationship with or support for the fascist regime, and you also have an entire room of aero painting and aero sculpture and even an actual aeroplane displayed, deracinated from their cultural context of what what those kinds of images and that technology would have meant for colonized subjects in the 1930s. So that's something I tried to sort of recuperate. And so what does it mean for an avant-garde that was deeply problematic ideologically to have an afterlife, which also has some, redemptive qualities to it. I mean, and you hear everything from eco-futurists to Indo-futurists to Afro-futurists to, various elements which kind of reuse that aegis as something potentially progressive. At one point, Marinetti says, progress at any cost. And of course, there is the rub, right? I mean, is progress that doesn't take into account its moral failings a good in its own right? The futurists themselves were what we would call anti-positivist, like so many avant-gardes at the beginning of the 20th century. They were suspicious towards this notion of science and technology as always and only leading to the perfection and good of society as it improved, right? And this is another element of futurism that I think is widely misunderstood, that futurists were interested in technology and machines, but not in a rationalist way. These individuals, Boccioni, Balla, Luigi Russolo, they were going to mediumistic seances more than they were going to seminars on science, right? They were interested. They fetishized machines and technology as gods, as new myths. Essentially, these were spiritual guides to be listened to, not rationalist vectors of enlightenment, right? It was about this notion that in the absence of religion, in the absence of reason, in the absence of a kind of guiding ideology from on high, what do we turn to? And there, every modernism has its version of primitivism, and for the futurists, that primitivism was technology in a certain sense. They said we are primitives of a new sensibility. That said, as I hope I've laid bare, they also occasionally, intermittently kind of availed themselves increasingly of the 30s of actual African and even Native American and Asian primitivisms to kind of re-dynamize futurism. But yeah, I don't know if those are sufficient answers, or if you have further kind of sub questions to those, or we can also start opening things up to the audience. Yeah, why don't we? Is that okay if we do that now? Yeah. Sure. Yeah? Great. I think there's a microphone. Oh yeah, he's gonna bring the.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting. I have a question. I mean, I think myself and probably other in the room, I'm fascinated about the parallel between futurist fascism and Trumpism and Muskism, right? And in the case of futurism, it's clear that it was an artistic movement with an ideological guidance. Do you see an artistic movement in the current environment? I don't, but maybe I missed something. And the other question, and what do you make of that? And the other question, and I don't know if there is an answer or it's just like I picked on it, but I was struck by the relationship with Africa of fascism and futurism, and the fact that the Trump administration, this is This Week in News, want to close all the U.S. embassy in Africa. You probably missed that, but there is a reform. I mean, among the many things that are happening, there's a reform of the diplomatic service of the U.S. And like the fascists did, the Trump administration wants to basically kill the career diplomatic service and makes it all by co-option. And as part of this, there's also the intention to close all the U.S. embassies in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I guess nowadays the sort of neo-fascist imperialist project is limited to, places like Greenland and other kind of more easily perhaps assimilable places. Trump isn't interested in what he calls shithole countries, whether for, extraction or otherwise, except, like in the case of Ukraine. I'm not certain the extent to which I can't speak to to this policy on diplomacy, and I would hesitate to make any sort of link between Trump's policy with regard to African countries and that of the fascist regime. Your first point is a very good one, which is for all of these individuals being likened to. Or even Trump himself, right? I mean, Mussolini was an active reader of people like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Bergson and George Sorel. I mean, he actually read things. So, there's just a difference in terms of cultural level, which is one thing that always strikes me personally. But also, yes, these are sort of I mean, they've obviously cherry-picked elements of futurism. This guy Andreessen and other Silicon Valley, tech mystics, basically, for their own ideological purposes, but are not interested in any of the obviously aesthetic baggage in which it's couched. So you're right. I mean, and this is something that many of us or some of us have been called on to answer. How is it that it's all well and good to say that yes, there's this neo-fascist culture going around, but what's the culture, right? And to that I would say that of course there are still myths and symbols and rituals, whether they are, you see them on display in certain instances, but there is not the same kind of investment in culture as the kind of anchor of ideology that one would have. Mussolini was giving inaugural addresses at different exhibitions in the 1920s. In one instance with Margherita Sarfatti, this art critic was his lover, so he had a kind of vested interest in doing so. But you would never find an American politician giving addresses at museum or gallery openings, with an actual interest in the works on display. Those are. That era is gone, I guess.
Just a follow-up and an input on the culture under Trumpism and Muskism. You might want to read Jill Lepore, an Harvard historian. She's linking, and clearly you can see why, Muskism and Trumpism to superhero cartoons and video games and... that's
they're
the
also
culture.
doing that. They're also doing that themselves, right? They're linking themselves to the. There are all kinds of images of Trump as Superman circulating. That, but that's a kind of debased form of culture, I suppose, a pastiche, really, rather than an actual, organic relationship to culture, I would say.
Can I just jump in there just quickly? I think it's right about the no culture thing, but just in terms of the mode of delivery, or I guess the kind of communication strategy, I see some parallels, with Marinetti and Trump. I mean, flooding the zone with shit is one of the things that Marinetti did, right? He just produced thousands and thousands of copies of things and distributed them everywhere. And, they weren't all that great. Like, some of the manifestos that some of the fellow futurists wrote were kind of banal, like, frankly, the futurist tie and all this kind of stuff, right? And, there's also, I think, a similar strategy in terms of, again, not the content, but the communication around, I guess I just made a note while reading your book about the futurist strategy of creating outrage to propagate, right? So in other words, what you do is you say something outrageous or do something outrageous, not because you really care about the thing you're being outrageous about, but merely to propagandise yourself. And so it's kind of this content-free zone in a way. It's really the mode of delivery that is the is the culture, actually. So that's the thing.
I mean,
say.
Marinetti's first novel, Mafarca the Futurist, was put on trial for obscenity, in part because it's, again, a novel which takes place in North Africa and features a North African hero. It's also a deeply racialized and racist novel, but its protagonist at one point has a 9-meter labile detachable penis, which also serves as the mast of a ship. Various things got him into trouble, but the trial for the novel itself served as further advertisement for the book. It was an extension of the book. It was a performance of the book. It brought aesthetics into real time and space as an act. And so you're absolutely right that in a sense, this notion of politics itself as spectacle, of spectacle as politics, is and also the notion of that no publicity is bad publicity, right? That even a trial for obscenity gets one converts rather than defectors. So you're absolutely right to underscore that. There was another question. There's one in here and then one in the back. Yeah.
So. Thank you, Ara. I just started reading the book. It's a page turner. I really like it. I'm just going to ask you a question about a chapter I haven't read yet, which is a chapter in which you talk about futurist intermedia. So interestingly enough, I think with a deliberate anachronism, you're using a terminology that is from Dick Higgins, from the Fluxus movement. So that implies that we are not only talking about multimedia, about a dimensional expansion of an artistic product into olfactory or visual, verbal dimension, but intermedia implies a certain commutability between the various modes of delivery. Implies the fact that you are almost reaching above the individual modes of delivery themselves to look for some kind of formula that can be applied to a concretization that will turn into either a poem but could turn into an object or into something that could be between the two, etc. I very much see in the declarations and manifestos of the futurists something that pushes in that direction. I wondered, and I wanted to ask you whether this is another aspect of futurism that remained perhaps partially aspirational, or that is programmatic. We have many examples of futurist music that, if you read Pratella, he talks about dodecaphony, polyrhythms, and microtonality, and then in his music there is none of that, right? The project is there, the realization not yet. So what about intermediality? Would you say that there is kind of this proto-Fluxus approach in some of their works, or is it more in the programs than in the works?
Yeah, you're right that I've sort of anachronistically sort of applied. I mean, in part because of Futurism's I suppose outsized influence on Fluxus and those various movements by the late 60s and 70s, when Futurism kind of got taken up again, bracketing its ideological compromises, but obviously dynamizing this notion of influencing and erupting in every single medium. I don't think that there was a kind of any sort of ambition towards programmatic like sort of intermedial manifestation. I think it was more just this notion that at one point Boccioni says down with these categories of painting and sculpture and drawing and enough with these sort of limiting classifications. And as Anthony was saying before, that happens on a microscopic level to the extent that, or a physical level where he has sculpture of a head plus house, and the head actually has a braid of hair, and there is actually a window jamb that is incorporated into the sculpture, right? So this is an idea of breaking down boundaries, not just between the real and the artificial, but also between media is something that kind of is this originary this futurist impulse, which again, like I said, is sort of part of this avant-garde unconscious, I guess, of the 20th century that that informs all these different manifestations.
Say something, but it seems to me in response to what he's saying that Cage really abandoned the idea of an art object. I mean, there's a real break. I mean, and in that sense, futurism is truly like the 19th century. I mean, they talk all the time. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, we all use the word, and now we all like the word intermediate, but in a way, they never abandoned painting, sculpture, etc. And that's the problem with, I want to say, a lot of futurism. A lot of it is just, you know, I mean, in a way, you could say it's not an avant-garde movement at all.
Well,
I mean, in Cage, it's truly a paradigm shift.
Yes, there's not the conceptual. I agree that there's not, you know, for all of futurism to, you know, vow to destroy and this and that, they still fetishize painting and sculpture. There was still a market. They still had collectors.
Which is why they couldn't do photography and film. Film is a very weak medium in futurism because basically it was too close for comfort. They didn't know how to do it.
Yes, but at the same time, the concepts, the conceptual turn, which doesn't happen in the works, happens in futurism's essentially parallel activity, which is that of theorizing and manifesto making, right? I mean, Franz Marc, writing to Kandinsky in 1914, says, like, you know, as for their works, they're like the most epigonal, derivative pieces of crap I've ever seen, but their ideas are amazing, right? So the conceptual intervention is there. It's maybe not concretized in the actual works, and nor is it lived out in their professed, you know, Marinetti says, let's spit on the high art of all, the high altar of art every day, right? The Dadaists do this. The futurists don't. The Dadaists actually do, of course, abandon the work of art, the fetishization of the market and the work of art, the commodity, etc. But, you know, when you read Marinetti, you know, the Multiplication of Man manifesto and other things, where he talks about the negation of the I, about, you know, the negation of the first person, of, you know, that is undeniably that is the start of Dada and constructivism right there. This notion of this abjuration of, at once, of course, he still believes in creative genius, but he's also abjuring the notion of the hand as the. So yes, I absolutely agree with you that I often run into this notion that, okay, for all of their rhetoric, they're still, you know, interested in actual objects, but at the same time, when, you know, their influence through theory is, I think, where the conceptual stuff happens. But that's a completely valid point. I think Kenny has a sure.
When you say it's cosmopolitan and also, but was it in fact a movement that allowed every other country to have its own nationalist movement?
No, I mean, yeah.
Because in a way, if you it's about doing your own nationalist shtick.
Well, this is the thing. That's the thing is, you know, when people often ask me about, well, you know, how were not the different fascisms essentially ultimately going to be in conflict with each other, right? Yeah. I think, you know, Marinetti wanted at once to say, and in fact he did repeatedly, that every avant-garde, from suprematism to surrealism, was futurism, essentially by a different name, right? He wanted to claim that primacy, that genealogical primacy, while also claiming the specificity of Italian genius. So, yeah, it is, I mean, in some ways, it's like saying, well, weren't Naziist nationalism and fascist nationalism on a collision course, right? You can't believe in the supremacy and primacy of your own nationhood without setting yourself on a collision course with others, right? It's a similar kind of problem, I suppose. But I guess his, you know, he wanted them to be able to develop all of these in every single country as long as they ultimately acknowledge the primacy of the Italian, you know, the originary Italian. But again, that's a really fabulous question. Kenny has a question in the back. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you had the mic, Isa. No, go.
It's really fine. It's not bad.
No, Isa, go.
Okay.
Go.
It's a brief question. It's because we've been kind of talking around, it seems, the legacy of futurism in the Italian neo-avant-garde, right? So that's something that I was thinking. I was wondering if you could talk more about, especially we were talking about the negation of the I, which of course was not only in the Italian neo-avant-garde. You know, you see this in Olsen, you see this in, you know, Black Mountain kind of, but there's also the question of paratexts and the importance of paratexts. And maybe what I would say, not to be, betraying my own aesthetic sensibilities of like, I think a lot of the Gruppo 63, for instance, their paratextual production for me is much more interesting than their actual poetry. So I don't know if that's a resonance.
No, I agree. I mean, like same thing with Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery and stuff like that. Their actual poems are far less interesting to me than this sort of parapraxis. I agree. I mean, I guess, I suppose, I wonder the extent to which Futurism is as influential on the neo-avant-garde, the Italian neo-avant-garde, as someone like Pound, for example. But it's undeniable that even the sort of typographic experiment, the kind of concrete poetry experiments, the Marinetti called it negation of the I, but the Italian neo-avant-garde is called the riduzione dell'io, right? The reduction of the self. So absolutely. I've never been a huge fan of the Italian neo-avant-garde. I guess that's my betraying my own Pasolinian kind of. I've always liked more sort of the lyrical confessional poetry of an old school. I'm not cool enough to like John Ashbery's poetry. But yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you so much for this energetic introduction. In the beginning, you mentioned this was the first comprehensive avant-garde, right? Yeah. And then later you said something about the totalitarian approach and design is everything, becomes everything. So I'm wondering, as this is a very short introduction, which tries to give an overview. How do you explain the historical conditions of possibility for the emergence of this comprehensive avant-garde? And is that what makes it so easy to mobilize for the fascist political project?
I'm really glad you asked this. So basically, in Nuce, the argument of the book, or of both books essentially, is that Futurism's drive towards totality, towards reconstructing the universe in Futurism's image is, of course, eventually becomes both a model and springboard for fascism and in sync with fascism. But in the event, because of its fundamental, simultaneous, anti-bourgeoisness but philo-capitalist kind of underpinnings, it's actually capitalist totality that Futurism ends up anticipating much more than fascist totalitarianism. Pasolini himself says in the 60s and 70s that neo-capitalist, through design, through consumerist culture, through language, that the late capitalist totality, the extent to which it governs the totality of our existence, dwarfs what Mussolini and fascism ever could have imagined its totalitarianism had done, right? And essentially that's kind of the, I suppose, argument, which I hope is somewhat novel, which is that, of course, Futurism becomes the sort of model, the paradigm in some ways for fascist totality and totalitarianism, but its more insidious and kind of lengthy afterlife is one in which we're still living, which is a late capitalist one, basically. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the privilege of the microphone. If the age of enlightenment is a misnomer, and if eugenics played a part in colonialism in pre-United Nations recognizing Italy as a country, as opposed to post-Risorgimento. And pardon me, I speak from a contadina place. If one looks at the American parallel or analogous society in terms of the images of the little boy Sambo, these were books that were forced on kids in my generation. That's the book you were given to read in first grade, second grade, and it was the most mean-spirited indoctrination, forcing people to become racists without knowing that this is what they were being forced to become. I graduated and went to the biography of Malcolm X at 15, but that's another story. In terms of Futurism, I love the word. I love Afrofuturism. When I think about the 1930s as an American, I think of a film called The Wizard of Oz, and the big image of the Oz on screen and his presence as though that were Mussolini in Italy. I think of futurism in terms of looking at a show called The Wiz and the positivity and the Afrocentric voice and presence in the performing arts as very central to a resistance, but also very central to a transformative society. And we know that the elitist that you pointed out in the very beginning of your presentation is a version of a Musk. And those who don't believe that they're above the law, that the rules apply, do not apply to them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the last part of what you said is very helpful to the extent that, just like the futurists, Musk and his ilk, I suppose, have a real ambivalence between populism, or what we now call populism, and elitism, right? I mean, the futurists that once wanted to use the public, a greater public, that would be the engine of modernism. That would be the engine of modern life, right? The mass public is now the generator of modern aesthetics and modern experience. But at the same time, the futurists also remained invested in a kind of genius, in the notion of artists as the Nietzschean and Bergsonian arbiters through intuition and will of the true absolute to which a vast public does not necessarily have access. And so that is how, in some ways, this futurist paradox lives on in a creature like Musk, who also, of course, has the cachet of supposedly being this great technological innovator and entrepreneur, which is not so different from someone like Marinetti. That's maybe neither here nor there, but yeah, thank you for your comment. Maybe we have time for one more, and then.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for the talk, and I was curious. Something that you brought up during your initial presentation, and I think also again about the anti-bourgeois aspect, but philo-capitalist component of it, and just thinking about also this earlier question about where is the cultural component of Trumpism, and to me there seems like there's an echo in Trumpism of the anti-bourgeois, but maybe there's something about, rather than focusing on the culture as in the artist, the sort of like genius of the artist, that the anti-bourgeois means, in this case, a sort of evacuation of bourgeois interiority, of creativity, and in fact, completely dumping the cultural component into automation through AI, like the AI slop imagery of, Trump with an eagle perched on his shoulder that, draped in the American flag and that kind of thing. Anyway, just kind of curious, or also if you want to riff on the anti-bourgeois but pro-capitalist thing, because I think there could be some interesting developments out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all are at various times confronted with the, in this case, maybe not even necessarily paradox, but the contradiction between even narratives, even cinematic narratives, like, even the updating of the Star Wars franchise, right, which continues this like deeply anti-imperialist. Of course, everyone is on the side of the Republic and the rebels, until they start, a political encampment that disrupts people's lives, right, for 10 minutes. So the notion of a kind of a kind of culture that at least in rhetoric is and on the surface in terms of form is anti-bourgeois, but preserves the mechanisms of and depredations of late capitalism, is something that that's like the air that we breathe nowadays, right? and so in some ways, it's almost a kind of case study earlier in the century of how that might have a kind of prehistory in some ways for, for what we're living in. Of course, in some ways, that's like this is the argument that the mid and even late and early kind of communist rhetoric, right, is that fascism is basically just that it for all of its revolutionary energy, it actually just preserves capitalism with a nationalist veneer, which has some substance to it. So yeah, that's a huge topic, which I think in the case of futurism that we can sort of see in various ways, like the notion that these very sort of dynamic surfaces and jagged edges and explosions of form are of course related to a certain kind of political anarchy and rebellion and resistance, but the circuits, both economic and institutional, in which they circulate eventually, are not necessarily rebelling against or even necessarily eventually even dynamizing the ways by which they're replicated and sold and commodified, basically. That would be the short answer. But I just want to thank so much my interlocutors for their generous reading and comments, and we can all sort of adjourn upstairs, and I'm happy to chat further, as I'm sure we all are. So thank you guys so much for coming.